Good evening and welcome to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of African Art online. My name is Dr. Lanisa Kitchiner, and I have the high joy and privilege of directing the Education Department at the museum. Now, the mission of the National Museum of African Art is to inspire conversations about the beauty, the richness, and the diversity of African art. And one of the ways that we realize our mission is through the Education Department, which is responsible for engaging multiple diverse communities in the interpretation of our collections and our exhibitions. We engage communities in the meaning-making process so that our programs, our educational activities, and our outreach efforts are not only relevant, but also reflective of and representative of and well-connected to the histories, the cultures, the peoples, and the arts of Africa and the African diaspora. Tonight's program, Get Up and Get Moving, examines the life and legacy of Josie Mpama Palma, a Black woman freedom fighter from South Africa whose resilience, strength, and courage tackled challenges of racism and sexism at the height of apartheid in South Africa. Mpama Palmer's story resonates across time and place, demonstrating the power of collective work and the critical role of community in the process. Now, our director emerita of the museum, Dr. Janetta Betch-Cole, is often, she often cites an African proverb that goes a little something like this: if you want to go fast, then go alone. But if you want to go far, then go together. And dare I say that Josie Mpama Palmer's life story offers a beautiful blueprint, not only for the struggles of her time, but for how to overcome the freedom struggles of our time. We must do it with force, with faith, and we must do it together. So it is in that spirit that I open tonight's program. And I'm so happy that you are here to join with us. We're also joined by Doctors Robert Edgar and Krista Johnson of Howard University. Dr. Johnson is Associate Professor of African Studies. She's a South Africanist scholar whose research interests range from topics in women and gender and sexuality studies to topics in HIV/AIDS and male circumcision. She has numerous publications to her credit, including the Encyclopedia of South Africa with Sean Jacobs, and a special issue of New Political Science Journal focused on social policy making and inequality in the era of globalization. Dr. Robert Edgar is one that I affectionately call the Awesome One. He is a renowned South African historian and is Professor of African Studies at Howard University and Senior Research Fellow at Stellenbosch University. His publications include An African American in South Africa, Travel Notes of Ralph J. Bunch, and The Finger of God, Enoch and Jijima, the Israelites, and the Bullhook Massacre in South Africa. Our program will run for about 45 minutes. It will include a presentation by Dr. Edgar, contextualization and conversation with Dr. Johnson, and audience questions. Without any further ado, it is my high privilege and honor to turn your attention to Doctors Robert Edgar and Krista Johnson. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lanisa, for that warm introduction, and I think you really set the stage for us very nicely. I would just add as well that I think it's really quite timely that we are discussing, that we have this book published on Josie Mpama Palmer, and that we're able to discuss her life and her work and her activism in South Africa, given really the global climate, but certainly the climate in the United States that we have now, where issues of racial injustice and discrimination are forefront in our minds. But what's really, I think, for me, really relates this book to the current moment are a few things. One is the way really in which this current movement and moment of Black Lives Matter really has highlighted the role of Black women and female activists and activism in the struggle for racial justice and social justice. But more importantly, how actually their activism in some ways is, I guess, more deep and different in this in regards to them always having more focus on bread and butter issues and more community-based focus issues. So it's interesting to me now how the conversations are turning to really very everyday life experiences of Blacks and the very everyday injustices that Blacks and people of color oftentimes confront. So I'm sure Dr. Edgar will kind of bring out her work, but to show that that really is what Josie Mpama was about as well. The other link or I guess parallel that I see to the current movement as well is her upbringing and her I guess the roots of her activism in this small South African town, Potchefstroom, which many probably haven't even heard of. But again, I mean, I think one of the unique moments that we're living in now is that we're seeing Black Lives Matter rallies and demonstrations and movements emerging in not just New York City and Washington, D.C. and, you know, Minneapolis, but in small town USA, right? You know, and in these smaller communities. And really, hopefully Dr. Edgar will say something about how, you know, it's in these small communities that people might go unnoticed and unknown, but really that's how movements get built, right? You know, and it's through that movements get built. And then my third just kind of, you know, link that I'm really thinking this book really kind of resonated with me in the current moment is also how scholars, contemporary scholars are really beginning to rethink the notion and the ideas of Black internationalism and really recognizing that, you know, that is so much, and we need to understand it as so much more of a complex, in so much more of a complex ideology and kind of terminology. And that there were expansive ways in which people demonstrated Black internationalism. It wasn't simply the, you know, W.E.B. Du Bois's or the Pan-Africanists. So you'll see again in the story of Josie Mpama, her life and her personality was a very complex and sometimes contradictory one, right? And so that it's not this kind of straightforward story of a, you know, a leftist activist, but, you know, one which is much more, you know, kind of layered with all kinds of other, you know, characteristics of who this woman was. So I think for all three of those reasons, it's really very timely for us to be able to discuss this. So I'm very pleased, obviously, to be joining Professor Edgar in discussing his book. And I wanted to just start off, Dr. Edgar, by asking you to maybe explain to the audience what prompted you to begin this research and to delve into this project in the first place.
Thank you, Krista and Lanisa. Let me start by expressing my thanks to the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art for organizing this program. And given my illiteracy with technology, I appreciate all the efforts of her and her staff for putting this together. Secondly, I'd like to thank Ohio University Press for publishing this volume. In their Short Histories of Africa series. I've had a long and very fruitful relationship with Ohio University Press, and they were one of the premier publishers for African issues. This book is available on the Ohio University Press website as a paperback. I'll tout it as 20% off right now. And they also have a Kindle version as well. So you can get that through other ways as well. Finally, I'd like to thank my own department, the Department of African Studies at Howard University, which was my home for 39 years. And the department has always been a source of support, encouragement, and inspiration for my research projects. Now, let me address the question that Dr. Johnson raised, and that is, how did I get interested in Josie Mpama? Well, I'm going to date myself because my interest in her was piqued about 40 years ago in 1980, when I met Edwin Thabo Mofutsenyane in Lesotho. He was had been a leader of the South African Communist Party. Sorry about that. That's what I mean by being technologically illiterate. But Ndati Mofutsenyane had been a leader of the Communist Party in South Africa and the African National Congress in the 1920s through the 1950s. And he had gone into exile in Lesotho in the late 1950s and had hidden himself deep in the mountains of Lesotho. I was able to track him down. It involved riding a few horses as well as climbing mountains, things that I couldn't do these days. But I had an extended week-long conversation with him in 1981. And he told me about his wife from the late 1920s through the late 1930s, Josie Mpama. And that was really the first time that I had encountered her name. So if we could put on slide number 1, we have a picture of Edwin Mofutsenyane around 1940. I'm going to put this up on the screen. I hope it comes through. This is a picture of Thabo Mofutsenyane in 1992 when I brought him to Johannesburg. He had been away from the city for over 30 years. And you can probably make out a few of those characters. He's in the middle. I'm on the right-hand side of the photo. And of course, Nelson Mandela is on the right side of the photo. And so we had an audience with the great one, Nelson Mandela. And I think it indicates the importance of Mofutsenyane. Well, for a variety of reasons, I wasn't able to follow up on Josie Mpama until the early 1990s. And that's when I began to research her. Was able to interview 3 of her daughters, several of her grandchildren, and actually the grandchildren over the last few decades have been really important helps on a lot of fronts. I also consulted Black newspapers, government records, court records, estate records, but really the most important find was in Moscow, Russia. In 1935, Josie had gone to Moscow to study at a Communist Party school for a year. And while she was there, she wrote a number of essays and an autobiography about her childhood, which really opened up an amazing amount of information. So we see there a baby photo of Josie from a family album from 1903 when she was born. So those records that I found in a Communist Party archive in Moscow were extremely important in terms of filling in some major gaps in her life. The upshot is that now, several decades later, I finally put everything together with this biography of her. There are lots of gaps. I hope sometime people are going to come up with additional information. And I hope other historians, especially young Black women, especially in South Africa, are going to take up this cause of reconstructing the lives of Black women and their activism in South Africa.
Thank you, thank you. So that's an appropriate kind of segue into my second question, just to give the audience an opportunity to understand who was Josie Mpama.
Yeah.
Palmer.
And I'm going to go. I'm going to go into her life with a bit of length, and we can take off the baby photo if it's not off already. Don't put the other photos on as yet. But Josie was born in 1903, a year after the end of the Anglo-Boer War. She was born, as Krista indicated, in Potchefstroom, which is a small town about an hour and a half drive west of Johannesburg. When she was born in 1903, it was a highly segregated town, dominated by a white minority. Her father was Stephen Mpama, who was a Zulu who had received some education in mission school. And around that time that she was born, he had become a court interpreter, which in African society was one of the highest positions that one can have. And it was a really difficult task because it involved translating not only one language into another, but multiple languages in another. Her mother was somebody with a mix of races, Afrikaners, Mfengu, Basotho. It was quite a very rich background. Now, something happens in 1910 that is going to dramatically alter Josie's life. Because her father was a court interpreter, it looked quite possible that she would get, a good education, have opportunities for some advancement. But in 1910, her parents get divorced. There's a battle over custody. Her father, at least according to the court papers, got custody, but that set off a struggle over where she was going to live. Her father found it very difficult to take care of her. She was shunted from one family member to another and often treated abysmally. She desperately wanted to be with her mother, and when she finally was allowed to do so, her mother was in poor health and she was in her early teens, Josie, and she had to take up a variety of positions as a cook in a white home, a maid, a seamstress, a cleaner, washing clothes, a variety of things to make ends meet. And one of the points that I make from that, and she comments on this later in her life, she said, my childhood was important to me because it taught me to be independent. It taught me that I had to survive on my own, and that becomes a hallmark of her life, her independence. And secondly, it drives home the point that she follows up on politically, and that is she had a great passion for protecting and preserving Black family life and community life as well. Now, Josie gets involved in political movements in the late 1920s in Potchefstroom. She called Potchefstroom and the Black location there. Am I having problems with my photo?
No.
Pardon?
No, we can see you. Sorry.
Okay, something's gone wrong with my screen, but I'll go ahead.
Okay.
But in the late 1920s, the white municipality in Potchefstroom was trying to raise revenues. And one way they were trying to raise revenues was off the backs of Black people in the Black location in the town. And in a sense, whites were expecting Blacks to pay for their own oppression. And one of the big issues that was taken up, especially by Black women, was the introduction of a lodger's permit. And that required, in Black families, anyone who was over the age of 18, let's say a son and daughter who were living in the household, they had to start paying a fee to get this permit. And what it meant was the white municipality was basically trying to drive these young people out of their parents' home. And so many families, Black families in Potchefstroom, were outraged by this. They were also outraged by the white superintendent of the Black location. His name was Andries Weeks. And if one wanted to come up with a picture of just an out-and-out racist oppressor, you couldn't do any better than Andries Weeks. He strode around the location. He had a sjambok, which is a whip made of hippopotamus skin. And he would go around whipping people, intruding into their homes at odd hours. He was really a prime example of somebody that you could rally people around. Well, in the late 1920s, Josie gets involved in the local politics, in the protests against the lodger's permit as well as other issues. And it's at that time that the Communist Party, in the form of Thabo Mofokeng, comes to Potchefstroom. Why the Communist Party? Well, there were two major reasons. One, they were a party of action. They were willing to go out to some of these small areas. And secondly, they had lawyers who were willing to represent the people in court cases. And they were actually quite successful in many cases in Potchefstroom in terms of defending people and challenging the white municipality. So in the late 1920s, Josie joins the Communist Party. She becomes a leader of the struggle taking place in Potchefstroom. And in 1930, there's a situation in which she and other people, especially Black women, become the leaders of an attempt to shut down the town of Potchefstroom. They basically organize a boycott, control people coming in and out of the downtown area, and they scare the hell out of the municipal officials. Ultimately, the municipal officials, and we see this in a lot of situations, they're able to regain control of the situation. But it's an example of how Josie gets her feet wet in terms of local politics, and she carries that over in the decades to come. In the early 1930s, she and Thabo Mofokeng are expelled from Potchefstroom. They go to Johannesburg, where they find a place to stay in Sophiatown, which is a fascinating township, very vibrant township. And there, she's going to live for about the next 20 years. As I mentioned, she joins the Communist Party. In the early 1930s, she really had not understood what communism was when she first joined the party, but she begins to develop an interest in it, and she wants to go to a party university for training party leaders in Moscow. So she lobbies to do that, and then she takes off on a fascinating trip with Matilda First, the mother of Ruth First. The First family were actually quite well-off people, but they supported the Communist Party. And so Josie went as her nurse attendant on a trip to the Soviet Union. And of course, Josie was going there to study at this party training school. And she gets to Moscow in 1935, and just imagine that, a Black woman from South Africa going to Moscow and basically having to fend largely for herself during that time period. It's a very difficult and troubling period in the Soviet Union, obviously with the purges taking place by Stalin. And while she was there, she gets caught up in a intra-party dispute within the South African Communist Party. The 30s was a time when the party was basically devouring itself over ideological splits. And so a commission is set up by the Communist International, the Comintern, to try to resolve this issue. Josie is called in to testify in it, along with several representatives of the different factions from South Africa. And it was a dead serious affair. Josie was trying to ensure that she wouldn't be caught up in terms of who won and who didn't win, because the people who didn't win were likely going to have a pretty dire fate, and that's exactly what happened. Moses Kotane was allowed to go back to South Africa, as was Josie, but the losers in the situation, Laserbach and a couple of brothers, were told to stay in Moscow, and they eventually end up in detention camps where they lose their lives. Josie goes back to South Africa in 1935, and the chapters that deal with her during that time period are fairly rich in terms of all the things she got involved in. So if you could pull up the photo of her from her trip back to the Soviet Union. This is taken in Mozambique in 1935. And so you see her as she's roughly 32 years old. And then if we go to the next photo, you see a picture of her with her children. She had three daughters and a son. And it's a very nice family photo that the family allowed me to put in the book. Now, Josie gets involved in a range of issues during that period, but I'm going to focus especially on her views on gender, because they're very important those views are very important for understanding her politics and what issues she gets involved with. Josie wrote on a number of issues. She had very independent views that she was very willing to express candidly with people, and I saw that in the documents I found in Moscow. But one of the concerns she had was that Black women were basically being excluded by Black men in political activities. She talked about the fact that men would attend political events. They didn't want their wives attending. They preferred them to be in the kitchens and having a meal ready when the menfolk got back. And she wrote an essay, which I include in the book, in 1933, in which she spells out some of her problems with patriarchy in the African community. But she's very strong on this, and she writes several other essays in which she talks about the ways in which Black women can involve themselves. Now, in the late 1930s, she articulated the view that Black women should support Black men in politics and political actions. But in the 1940s, she shifts and she starts stressing that Black women should form their own organizations, and that would be the best ways in which they could articulate their positions and try to bring about policy changes. So what kind of issues was she interested in? Well, as in Potchefstroom, she very much was interested in bread and butter issues, things that involved the lives of Black women. So there were a whole range of things, from getting clean water, high rents, the lodgers permits, which were still a controversy, police raids, beer brewing, pass laws. In other words, as Krista was saying earlier, she's raising issues that one could find that resonate with what we are facing right now. But that was the way she believed that one could best mobilize Black women, by talking about practical issues that addressed practical needs. And so this becomes a hallmark of her political views, especially in the 1940s. Now, in 1948, and we move into the last phase of her life, the apartheid system is introduced in South Africa. Already you had a very strong system of segregation and racial oppression in South Africa. But apartheid magnifies that. It rigidifies racial policies. And also the Communist Party of South Africa is declared illegal in 1950. And so members of the Communist Party like Josie were looking for new homes. She would go to African National Congress rallies, and she had done that consistently in the past. And she also gets involved in the campaign that is brewing because the government wants to extend pass laws to Black women. Before, it was only Black men who had to carry passes. And these passes were documents that Black people had to carry with them all the time because they specified where you could live, where you could work, where you could move, and so forth. And so Josie became very active in terms of challenging the government over the pass laws. She also becomes a major figure in terms of the Federation of South African Women, which is formed in 1954. This is an interesting development because it's a multiracial group. It involves women from all the different racial groups. And they're organizing because they see common interests. Well, Josie is elected the president of the Transvaal branch, that's basically Johannesburg and surrounding areas these days. But because of health issues, she had asthma and osteoporosis. She had to drop out of politics. In addition, the government had issued a banning order, basically saying, we're silencing you. We're not putting you in jail, but we're silencing you. And they issued this banning order when women were organizing a march to Pretoria in 1955. What I want to do is read to you a quote from Josie. And there's a photo of Josie that I'd like you to pull up where she's speaking to a Federation of South African Women audience.
Yes, we have that up.
And I want to read to you this quote from her. This is 1955, and she's saying to her compatriots, I'm going to have to withdraw from being a leader of these organizations. And she says, and I'm quoting, my health has been a great barrier and has deprived me of my activities. But one is told to shut up in the face of bitter times ahead, when our women are going to be forced to carry passes, and our children are pushed back from the spark of light that they were enjoying to the dark old days of Africa, when they will become only able to serve their white masters. All those laws and legislations that bind us and force us to hold our tongues shall come to an end one day. Never were the minds of human beings controlled. Never were the eyes of human beings closed to what is happening unless that person goes blind. It is therefore natural that every living soul will ultimately see and follow the road to freedom, and freedom is in all caps. And she concludes, Josie or no Josie, the struggle will go on, and ours will be the day of victory. Now, remember again, that's 1955. And so she was very clear about the difficulties, the road ahead, but she was also very optimistic that ultimately they would secure freedom. Let me make one last point in terms of Josie's life before I conclude this portion of the discussion. In the 1940s, Josie, who had been a Wesleyan Methodist before, joins the Anglican Church. And the rest of her life, she becomes a very committed Christian, and specifically an Anglican. Did that mean she broke from the Communist Party? Did that mean she denied her communist background? No, she didn't see any distinction between the two, or a contradiction between being a Christian and someone loyal to the Communist Party. The way I analyze it, I see her as somebody who was committed to social justice. And when some leaders of the Anglican Church began to commit themselves to social justice issues, that became an attraction to her. But she was an extremely committed Christian, was very involved in women's societies in the church. If you pull up picture number 6, you'll see a photo of her in her church uniform with several of her children. This would have been in the early 1950s. Now, Josie dies in 1979. She's not totally engaged in politics, but she's certainly very supportive of her children and especially her grandchildren becoming involved in politics. And so, for instance, when the 1976 Soweto uprising takes place, Josie is someone who is supporting them and hiding them out when the police are going after her. I want to conclude this portion of our discussion with another quote from her from 1975 that appeared in Drum magazine. And she's sort of looking back at her life of service and where she wants young women to be headed. And she says, "I'm not as young and fit as I once was, but I will continue to do whatever I can to uplift my people. We women are the backbone," stressing that, we women are the backbone of the nation. And I would like to see many more women take an active interest in developing the community. We need more creches, more schools and recreation centers to curb juvenile delinquency. We also need old age homes. But we will not be given these things on a plate. We have to work for them. So I would like to end by saying to all my sisters, get up and get moving. And of course, when I read that, I said, you know, there's a title there for the book. So let me conclude on that note, and then I think Krista might have some additional questions, and then we'll have questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you. Let me just remind some of the audience or the audience members. I see that there's one question in the Q&A, but you can type your questions in the Q&A, and then I'll be happy to read those. Before I get to that one question, let me just ask Dr. Edgar, because you were kind of wrapping up on this. I mean, as you mentioned, the contradictions between, or potential contradictions between her Anglican faith and her deep Anglican faith, and then her membership in the Communist Party seem important, I guess. You talk about it in terms of shaping her life. Towards the end of her life, she didn't join when the Communist Party of South Africa became or dissolved, and then was birthed anew as the South African Communist Party. She didn't join that new party. And in addition to that, you talk about, especially in the 1940s, when you had, at one point you mentioned that she actually was involved in the 1930s in resurrecting the African National Congress, which at that time had kind of laid dormant for a number of years. So she was involved in that, but then by the 1940s, she was kind of dismissive, I think was the term that you used, of the ANC Youth League. And as the audience will recall, the ANC Youth League was comprised of people like Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo and whatnot. So I'm just curious, I mean, and you just kind of only said that. She clearly, well, maybe not. Do you think she clearly in her older age, was it just because of health reasons that she certainly didn't become a member of any of these political organizations later on in her life? Was it only political, her health reasons, or were there maybe other reasons for that?
Well, there are a variety of things, issues that you've raised there. One is, during the 1940s, I think there was a generational shift taking place in the African National Congress. She was actually one of the key organizers nationally for an anti-pass campaign in the mid-1940s. And she was doing that with senior ANC leadership. So she was very coordinating things with the ANC. She also got involved, and I don't mention it in the book, but she got involved in a mine workers strike in 1946. I've only learned that recently. In the 1950s, she does not join the underground South African Communist Party. I'm fairly confident in saying that. But at the same time, she continued to maintain relations with people who did go underground. Her granddaughters remember very prominent members of the Communist Party coming to their home, and she was also getting them to distribute some of the left-wing papers in the 1950s in the black townships. So on one level, she was not formally involved in politics, but at the same time, she was very much aware of what was going on. And I don't include this in the book, but I remember having a conversation with Ray Simons, who was a very prominent member of the Communist Party. And she said she got a note from Josie in the 1960s in which Josie said, you know, maybe you've heard that I'm, you know, not as active as I once was, but you should know that I'm still supporting the cause. So she wanted to make it clear that she was still staying on top of things, but there were limitations. By the way, in 1960, she was arrested by the government during a period of a state of emergency and spent a period of time in prison. And it was mainly because of her previous activities. It wasn't something she happened to be doing in 1960.
Interesting. My other question pertains to, I mean, one of the tidbits that you mentioned that I thought interesting was she grew up speaking English and Afrikaans.
Yes.
And didn't learn Zulu or any of the African languages until the 1940s. I mean, how common was that for, I mean, she as you said, her father was Zulu. Her mother, you know, had a number of, I mean, surely spoke a number of African languages. Her father most certainly did because he was the court interpreter. So, and then in addition to that, you mentioned that she insisted that when her grandchildren came to visit her, that they speak Afrikaans. Yes. And it seems like this is right at the time as well, when you mentioned as well that she supported their involvement in the Soweto student uprisings. But those uprisings were all about the use of the medium of
well,
Afrikaans.
that's the contradiction.
But speak to that contradiction a bit.
First of all, the language that was primarily spoken in Potchefstroom, and it still is pretty spoken very widely, even in the Black community, is Afrikaans. Setswana would be the primary language, but Afrikaans is commonly spoken there. And there's a segment of the Black population in which people do speak Afrikaans. They consider it not English, they consider Afrikaans to be their second language. And so one of the things I found in Soweto is that there's a small group of people who still use Afrikaans in their homes. In 1976, it wasn't something they advertised because of the protests against Afrikaans, but that's still the case. There's a study to be done on Afrikaans, the Afrikaans language in the Black community. And I think it would be very revealing. The other thing I'd like to note is this book is titled Josie Mpama / Palmer. In the 1930s, when she had gone to live in Sophia Town and her children were young and going to school, her grandmother sort of strongly recommended that they anglicize the name Mpama to Palmer. because it would allow them to gain access to better schools. And what's interesting is from the mid-1930s on, sometimes you see her name in the press as Josie Mpama. In other cases, it will be Josie Palmer. Some of her grandchildren use the family name Palmer now. They live in Soweto. They're totally fluent in a variety of African languages, but they still use the name Palmer.
Interesting. Well, we have a few questions in the Q&A, so let me get to those quickly. So Lauren Thompson asks, Dr. Edgar, what was your process for piecing together Josie Mpama Palmer's life story? Did you interview her family members and friends? Were you able to access journals of hers? You've spoken a little bit to this, but I don't know if you want to expand on that.
Well, I'll just add a few things. You know, I met her three daughters in the early 1990s, and they, you know, talked quite openly. One of them was a daughter of Josie and Thabo Mofokeng. And so that was very important. They also, the granddaughter who still lives in the home that Josie had, she also introduced me to people in the neighborhood. So I had a chance to sit down with about 6 women one day from the neighborhood who knew Josie and, you know, talked about her at length. I also interviewed other people who had been friends of hers. There was one woman in particular who Josie took into her home and basically helped to raise her. And then her husband met her through the local Anglican church, and they got married. And so she's still alive, and I was able to interview her. But that was one thing about Josie that really struck me. She had an extraordinarily warm heart. And I think because of her childhood, of having such a rough time with family issues, she herself opened up her home, her heart, to a range of kids that she would find on the street.
Mm-hmm.
And they basically became part of her household. So it's these sort of human dimensions about her life that I think are important to keep in mind, because she was not only a political person, but she was somebody very devoted to her family as well. One final point, because of her upbringing in Potchefstroom, she learned Afrikaner folk medicine. She was the go-to person in her neighborhood when anybody got ill. They would come to Josie, and she had all sorts of home remedies that she would give to people. And I cite some of them in the book, but I thought that was another fascinating dimension to her life.
Yes. The next question is from Robert Vinson. So he says, thank you, Bob, for researching and writing about the amazing life of Josie Mpama Palmer. I'm sure that her family has enjoyed reading this book. Can you tell us more about their feedback about the book? And can you tell us more about Josie's alternate use of, you touched on this a bit now, Mpama and Palmer for her.
Well, I think I've addressed the latter issue,
yes,
but
right.
I sent them an invitation to watch this webinar, and they were excited to hear about it. But it's after 12 midnight in Johannesburg, so I told them that this will be on the Smithsonian website in the near future. I'm going to do a similar thing with a group in Johannesburg in September, and I hope they're there. So to answer Robert's question, I sent them a copy of the book on the web, and I haven't had any response. I asked one of her great-granddaughters, who is pictured in the book at Josie's grave, I asked her the other day if she had actually read it, and if they had any comments. So that's pending. I think they'll probably find a number of things about Josie's life that they didn't know. And I think they will be quite happy to learn these things, especially about the Mpama side of the family. But I'm also hoping that the book will also trigger more memories from them that we can include in a future edition. Of course, I'm hoping that we'll be able to get a South African edition of the book made available over the next, let's say, 6 months or a year, because I think there is a major audience in South Africa for this particular biography.
Indeed. Let me also just say, our colleague, good friend, Kudor Snell says, thank you for this highly informative and educative presentation by our esteemed Dr. Bob Edgar. Thank you for your scholarship and dedication to South African political history. I remain humbled by your knowledge about my own country.
Well, greetings to Cooter. And I think he would appreciate the comments on Josie and Afrikaans.
Yes. He also asks, I'll ask you to again just repeat where it is that folks can get a copy of the book. And then I do have one other question to ask you. So,
sure.
Where can folks get a copy of the book?
Well, they can go on the website of the Ohio University Press. And as I said, there's the paperback is available there, as well as a Kindle edition. Or they can go on some of the other internet sites. One of the things I like about Ohio University Press is that they have an option for independent bookstores, so you can buy it through an independent bookstore. Yeah, so there are multiple ways of getting the book.
Great. So David Anthony asks, are there any extant audio and or video recordings or motion pictures of Josie Mpama Palmer? Are these accessible? Did you find it?
Thanks, David, for your question. The answer simply is no, not that I'm aware of. Her family members, or her daughters, gave me a variety of photographs. And then Belinda Palmer, her granddaughter, who lives in Josie's home, it's become her home, she shared with me their family album. So that's why we were able to include a baby photo of Josie, as well as other photos. And I really am appreciative to them for giving me access to those photos. But sadly, I don't have any recordings of her that I wish I had. In the late 70s, before she died, Julie Wells, another South African historian, did interview her in person, but I'm almost certain she did not do a tape of Josie. I can double check with her, but her interview was also very helpful in terms of the Potchefstroom protests.
Interesting. David Hempson asks, thanks for your work, Bob Edgar. What was the reaction of her husband? I assume he's referring to Mufutanyana, to Josie's political views and work.
Well, in some cases they were on the same page, and in other cases they weren't on the same page. Their personal relationship by the late 1930s was, let's say, it was declining. But just to give you an example, and this is a very controversial issue, in the late 1930s, 1938 to be specific, Thabo Mufutanyana was the General Secretary of the Communist Party. And he introduced a resolution at the annual meeting in which the Communist Party would be split into black and white wings of the party, because he said on a practical level, black members of the party and white members of the party, they just live separate lives. They may overlap on various issues, but on a practical level, organizing on the street we just move in different directions. And of course, most white members of the party did not speak African languages. That's just a fact. So he introduced that resolution, and of course, it caused enormous consternation among Communist Party leaders. And the upshot was that Josie did not agree with his position. Moses Kotane, people like that, did not agree. And they basically said, look, we understand practically that Black and white members of the party do go separate ways with their lives, but if you separate the party into Black and white wings, it's no longer the Communist Party. And so Josie did support the position that opposed Mufutsunyana.
Yes.
And it didn't pass.
That's right. Let me get to our final question from Tara Hammonds. She says, good evening, Dr. Edgar. I'm working with some of your former HU colleagues on a new project. It's titled America Voices Against Apartheid, and it's funded by the US Mission in South Africa. Do you know whether Ms. Mpama had any contacts with American activists or knew about the US civil rights movement?
Yes and no. And this is, it was interesting. One of her granddaughters told me that in the 1960s, somebody brought a recording of Martin Luther King to her. And they played it, and she was so scared the police might come in and confiscate it that she hid it so well that the family couldn't find it until after she had passed away. I don't have any more indications other than that. It was a kind of indication that she was certainly aware of and was following the civil rights movement in the United States. But that's all I have. I mean, this is one of those major gaps that I have, and I would love to have more information to add to that.
Lovely. Well, thank you. I want to thank our audience for all those questions. I'm going to now turn it back over to Dr. Lanisa Kitchiner to just kind of close us out and send us home. Well, you're still muted, Lanisa. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Thank you so very much to the both of you. Of course, I was sitting here taking copious notes, as I often do whenever Howard University professors speak. And so if I may just steal a little bit of time as we approach the final minute of our program to raise a question, if I can. And that is to both of you, actually. First to you, Dr. Edgar, but also to you, Dr. Johnson, whose research is also in gender and women's studies. And that is how or whether Josie Mpama Palmer's legacy is celebrated in South Africa today. We're in a moment where there's yet another call for the toppling of monuments. We're in a moment where we see wonderful statues to Nelson Mandela, Madiba, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu. But I'm reminded that when we are talking about the imagery and the representation of women, there's the likes of Lillian Ngoyi, for example, who instead of a bust or a statue has a sewing machine in her honor. How would South Africa celebrate Josie Mpama's legacy today? How is she remembered on the ground?
Well, very quickly, her name is known, but it's not prominent. But I did meet with some activists in Potchefstroom who are very interested in promoting remembrances of her. And a couple of fellows that I talked to were even keen on putting up a statue of her in Potchefstroom. Last year, about a year ago, at her gravesite, a new grave marker was put up. And there was I'm not sure if they've had the commemoration event, and I think they've had to postpone that because of the COVID. But on a national level, she's been honored with with one award from the national government. But I think this book, and it's one reason why I wanted to do it, it will certainly focus attention on her. And I think there will be a dramatic growth of interest in who she was and what she stood for.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know.
Dr. Johnson, in light of your studies, what would you imagine in regard to this question?
Well, Josie Mpama is not someone that I knew of and had heard of before this book, before Dr. Edgar's book. So I think, but again, in reading this story, her story, I think it's just I think so important to tell these stories of not necessarily the most certainly not the most well-known figures, but even the most prominent figures in the ANC Youth League or in the ANC Women's League, or she didn't join the ANC Women's League when that was formed, but her story is really quite interesting because I think it gives you kind of more of an understanding of an ordinary activist, right? Or kind of activists, smaller. Well, I mean, she was in Sophiatown and in Soweto actually much of her adult life, but kind of smaller communities, smaller organizing. So I think I think it will be wonderful to see her honored and her story and her life's work, displayed more prominently and more prominently known. And I think, would certainly be an inspiration to those young South African women now who are coming up, who again are, joining movements which really, and leading movements, which really are addressing, more bread and butter issues.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. As a person who has just a foremost love for literature, I'm reminded at that moment when Dr. Edgar, you spoke about, women being the backbone of the nation. Immediately, I heard Zora Neale Hurston, another Howard Dyke, coming to mind, speaking of Black women as the mules of the world, carrying so much weight. And I thought to myself, well, Black women are also the heartblood of society and our shared humanity. As I think of, and I always try to put myself to personalize, the experience. I think about how whenever I get a scrape or a bruise, the first person I call is my mother. How now, when my son scores a point in soccer or gets his own scrape or bruise, he turns to me for validation. And I also think about George Floyd in his final moments calling, "Mama, mama, mama." If ever there was, I think, a person whose everyday story, that person, Josie Mpama Palmer, if anything, she represents to me just the value of women to society and how important it is for us to continue to do research in the ways that you have done it, Dr. Edgar. So thank you very, very much for your contribution, for sharing the heroic story of Josie Mpama Palmer with the Smithsonian Institution and the audience today. For those folks who are looking for more stories of heroism, I invite you to look at our website, africa.si.edu, where we have on view now an exhibition entitled Heroes, Principles of African Greatness, where you can see the likes of many stories of heroism, both in South Africa, but throughout the continent, as they are represented through the visual arts. I thank you very much all for joining us. Very deep thanks to you, Dr. Edgar, to you, Dr. Johnson, and to the staff of the National Museum of African Art, specifically Quanice Jackson and Michael Baird. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Juanice?